Welcome, and settle in. Tonight, you'll be taken on a quiet walk through the winding paths of medieval life, not through the well-trodden tales of knights and castles, but along the lesser-known trails of everyday survival. These are the soft footsteps in the margins of history, the habits and know-how passed from hand to hand, whispered between generations, and largely forgotten by the time candles gave way to gaslight. In this journey, there are no grand battles or royal intrigues. Instead, we'll sit beside peat fires, beneath thatched eaves, and watch as a woman binds herbs into bundles. We'll listen to the creak of a cart carrying dried fish inland, and the careful hum of a man sharpening a tool not for war but for cutting thatch or hollowing a log. The medieval world was one of practical endurance, shaped not just by kings, but by calloused hands and careful minds. So, breathe deeply. Let your thoughts slow, like footsteps on a dirt road. This is not a place for haste. This is the slow, enduring rhythm of medieval survival. Let us begin with the hearth, the heart of the home, and explore how one simple innovation sustained families through seasons of cold, scarcity, and change. Imagine yourself waking before the sun, your breath misting faintly in the cool stillness of a timber-framed cottage. The walls are daubed with a mixture of clay and straw, patched with care over generations. The floor is packed earth, swept smooth with bundles of twigs. But in the center of it all, flickering with a soft orange glow, is the hearth. In much of medieval Europe, survival began with fire. Not just any fire, but one carefully maintained and watched. The hearth wasn't simply a source of warmth. It was a tool of life used for cooking, preserving, curing, and even healing. Medieval families, particularly in colder climates, practiced the technique of banking the fire. Each evening before sleep, the embers would be covered with ash to smother the oxygen, slowing combustion but keeping the coals alive. In the morning, the householder would gently brush aside the cold grey to reveal a smouldering heart still warm enough to kindle flame. Starting a fire from scratch with flint and tinder was time-consuming and unreliable. To keep fire going was easier than to rekindle it. It became not just a household duty, but a communal safeguard. In some villages, if one hearth failed, another might share a glowing coal, passed carefully from neighbour to neighbour, on a shard of pottery or wrapped in a curl of dry bark. Near the hearth hung drying racks made from thin branches, bound with twine. Herbs like sage, thyme, and yarrow were strung up in bundles not for decoration, but for their medicinal and preservative properties. These herbs were gathered with intention, their uses handed down in quiet instruction. Thyme to ease coughs, yarrow to stanch blood, rosemary to strengthen memory. Cooking was done over a tripod or hook, with pots made from iron or clay. Bread might be baked in a communal oven, but soups and porridges were staples at home. These thick, slow-cooked meals stretched limited supplies and could feed many with little. The medieval peasants' potaged an ever-simmering mixture of grains, vegetables, and whatever might be foraged was not glamorous, but it was nourishing. Recipes changed with the seasons, evolving subtly with the rhythm of the land. In colder regions, homes were often built partly below ground level, using the earth itself as insulation. Windows were small or non-existent, often covered with oiled cloth or thin animal horn instead of glass. Beds were made with straw and covered in wool, if it could be afforded, with layers added in winter and removed in warmer months. Layers of cloth served not just as clothing, but as insulation, a survival strategy now replaced with modern fabrics, but no less ingenious in its time. One might also find, just beside the hearth, a small bowl of salt, precious, rationed, and essential. It was used not only to flavour food, but to preserve it. Meat and fish, when available, were dried, smoked, or brined. These were careful tasks, often done in groups, following knowledge that had no written record, but was encoded in habit and observation. Even the design of homes reflected survival needs. Thatched roofs were more than rustic charm, they insulated, diverted rain, and could even be used as a source of nesting materials or insects in desperate times. Thatch was layered thickly and bound tight, harvested from reeds grown near rivers or lakes. It was laid down by hand, often during the drier months, and required constant maintenance, but when done well, it could last for decades. In the absence of refrigeration or modern medicine, these subtle, sustainable techniques meant the difference between life and death. The hearth was the center of all this knowledge, a flickering thread, linking generations through memory, muscle, and repetition. As the day unfolds from that early moment at the hearth, so too do other forgotten arts of survival come to life outdoors, along the fields, into the forests, and beyond. In the next chapter of our journey, we will step outside and see how the medieval mind turned to nature not only for food, but for resilience, improvisation, and quiet ingenuity. Step gently now, out beyond the walls of the cottage. The morning air is cool and laced with the scent of damp moss and turned soil. The path before you is uneven, lined with wildflowers and creeping tendrils of ivy. Beyond the cultivated strip of garden where leeks and onions push through the earth, the forest waits. For many medieval people, especially those in rural or semi-isolated areas, survival was not limited to what could be grown or raised within enclosed plots. It extended into the woods, the hedgerows, and the winding riverbanks into a landscape rich with opportunity for those who understood its quiet language. Foraging was a deeply ingrained skill, often taught early in childhood. It was not the pastime it is today, but a cornerstone of seasonal nourishment. Berries in late summer like elderberries, sloes and bilberries were gathered and preserved in thick pastes or fermented into cordials. Nettles in spring were not considered weeds, but early greens, rich in nutrients after a lean winter. Mushrooms, too, were harvested, though cautiously. Knowledge of safe and dangerous varieties was passed with care, spoken like rhyme or proverb, guarded by experience. Roots such as burdock, dandelion, and wild carrot were dug in the fall when their energy retreated back into the soil. Even tree bark and inocambium, layers especially from birch or pine, could be scraped, dried, and powdered into flour during times of hardship. The forest was both pantry and pharmacy. Hazelnuts were stored in clay jars for winter use. Chestnuts, too, were ground into meal or roasted. Leaves from wild sorrel, chickweed, and goosefoot added flavour and variety to the daily stew. Near the edges of woods and fields, people often set small woven traps for birds, or rabbits grafted from willow or hazel rods. Simple, yet effective. Poaching, though technically illegal on noble lands, was sometimes the only means of protein for poor families, done quietly and with reverent stealth. Beehives, kept in straw skeps or hollow logs, offered not just honey, but wax for candelsa rare, and valuable source of light after dark. And yet, even wild bees were respected. Locating their hives and carefully harvesting without destroying the colony was a skill involving patience, observation, and often smoke. The rhythm of foraging followed the year, and survival meant remembering each cycle. Spring brought leafy greens and the first eggs. Summer overflowed with fruits, while autumn meant nuts, grains, and roots. Winter was a season of rationing, of using what had been dried or preserved. There was no waste. Bones were boiled into broth. Leaves became wrapping or binding. Ash from the hearth could be used in soap making or for scrubbing cloth. Fields, too, were part of the survival equation, but not in the way we might think. A single field might be part of a rotation system, third sown with wheat or rye, 1/3 with legumes or oats, and 1/3 left fallow to rest. This system, known as three-field rotation, allowed for soil regeneration and reduced risk of famine. It was a practical method rooted in deep observation of the land's needs, long before the science of agriculture had words for it. In between these strips of planted land grew the commons, open spaces where villagers grazed animals, gathered fuel wood, or harvested hay. These shared lands were essential, but governed by unspoken agreements and seasonal rhythms. Overgrazing or careless foraging was not just a breach of etiquette, it could endanger the entire community. And as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows between the trees and huts, families would return with baskets filled with the quiet spoils of the land. Not grand, not showy, but enough. A clutch of eggs, a handful of dried mushrooms, sticks of kindling, and a pouch of wild garlic. These, combined with grain and fire, built meals and seasons. They sustained both body and spirit. In this steady dance between forest and field, one sees not desperation, but a kind of calm resilience. The land provided sometimes generously, sometimes just barely, but through careful observation, reverent use, and shared knowledge, medieval people wove nature into every part of their survival. Now, as we return from the forest and step again into the settlement, let us turn to another kind of ingenuity, how survival was engineered, not with wood or fire, but with water, stone, and movement. In the next chapter, we will explore how medieval communities harnessed natural forces, from mills and wells to the secret art of staying clean in an often muddy world. Let the forest fade behind you now, as we turn toward the murmuring sound of water, not a rushing river or storm-fed torrent, but the steady, workmanlike trickle of a mill race. As you follow its gentle course, you arrive at one of the most important, yet often overlooked, pillars of medieval survival, the watermill. Here, beside a slow-moving stream, the water is carefully directed by wooden sluices and narrow channels. It flows not freely, but deliberately guided to turn a great wooden wheel fixed with paddles. As the wheel rotates with hypnotic grace, it powers a set of heavy stone gears inside a squat, low-roofed building. Inside, the smell is earthy flour, dust, old timber. You can almost hear the soft grind of millstones turning grain into coarse meal. The medieval watermill was not a luxury. It was a marvel of quiet engineering, essential to survival in many communities. Long before industrial factories, these mills harnessed nature's own rhythm to reduce hours of human labor. Grains like barley, rye, and wheat, staples of the medieval diet, were far more digestible and storable when ground. Before mills, this was done by hand, laboriously, with quern stones. The mill changed all that, but more than flour came from the water's power. In some regions, mills were adapted to full cloth beating and shrinking woven wool to make it denser and warmer. Elsewhere, water wheels powered bellows for forges or pulleys for raising buckets. All of this was made possible by careful observation of water flow, by building mill races and channels that bent nature's energy to human needs without disrupting its balance. Wells, too, were central to survival. Dug deep and often reinforced with stone, they were lined with wooden buckets or ceramic jugs, raised by hand or simple windlass. In wealthier homes or monasteries, water was channeled via clay pipes or aqueducts. Rainwater was collected from roofs and stored in barrels or cisterns, especially in drier regions where every drop mattered. Clean water was valued not only for drinking, but for hygiene, another area where the medieval world is too often misunderstood. Bathing did occur, often communally, and particularly in towns or regions with access to natural hot springs. Monasteries maintained bathhouses, where cleanliness was part of both health and spiritual discipline. Soap, made from tallow and lye, was widely known. Ash and sand served as scrubbing agents. In cities, bathhouses even offered steam treatments, with heated stones and aromatic herbs. But for those without access to structured facilities, hygiene was maintained with cloths soaked in warm water, with herbal rinses, or simple immersion in streams during warmer months. The belief that bathing was inherently dangerous did not become widespread until later, under different medical theories. In the early medieval world, cleanliness was pursued as a practical necessity, especially for those tending animals, crops, or preparing food. Beyond water and hygiene, stone played its own quiet role in survival. Stone walls preserved heat, marked property, and enclosed animals. Paved roads often inherited from the Romans connected distant settlements, enabling trade and communication. In monasteries and towns, stone channels directed rainwater away from foundations, protecting grain stores and cellars from rot. Even food preservation used natural forces cleverly. Root cellars were dug into cool, shaded earth. Cheese and meats were aged in stone-lined chambers where temperature and humidity stayed relatively constant. Ice, when it could be gathered in winter, was stored in deep pits insulated with straw for cooling perishables in the months that followed. This network of thoughtful structures, wells, mills, drains, walls, wasn't the work of a single generation. It evolved gradually, shaped by experience, adjusted after each harsh winter or dry season. Every improvement, however small, made survival just a little more likely. And perhaps that is the deeper story here. Survival in the medieval world was not about grand inventions or sudden breakthroughs. It was a steady accretion of knowledge of materials, of wind and water, of soil and stone. The people who lived then did not simply endure, they adapted, refined, and worked with the land in ways that still hold quiet wisdom for us today. Now, as the sun begins its slow descent and casts long golden light over the walls of village mills and drying fields, let us turn our thoughts to those who preserve not just grain or water, but knowledge itself. In the next chapter, we will slip into the hushed corridors of monastic life and explore how monks and scholars safeguarded survival through learning, writing, and quiet labor. Now we leave behind the rhythmic creak of the mill wheel and enter a different kind of silence, one not marked by the hush of the woods or the lull of a stream, but by quietude of the mind of cloisters, scriptoria, and sacred study. We enter the monastery. Set apart from the bustling village and distant from worldly affairs, the monastery might seem, at first glance, an unlikely place for survival. And yet, within its stone walls, another kind of endurance took root. Here, knowledge was preserved not only spiritual, but agricultural, medicinal, astronomical, and practical. It was a different way to weather the passing of time. The scriptorium was the heart of this quiet labor, a long, narrow room with tall, arched windows to catch the light. Along rows of wooden desks, monks worked slowly and deliberately, heads bowed over parchment. The scent of ink and vellum, beeswax and oil lamps filled the air. Each letter was crafted with care, using quills carved from goose feathers, dipped into ink made from oak galls and iron salts. Mistakes could not be casually erased. Each page was valuable, each word a small act of permanence. Copying texts wasn't simply about preserving religious scripture, though. That was certainly central. Many monasteries also copied works of Roman and Greek thinkers, treatises on medicine, farming manuals, and bestiary catalogues of animals real and imagined, often filled with symbolic meaning. Even mundane texts, such as estate records and planting calendars, found their way into the bound folios of the monastery. These texts would guide how herbs were grown in cloister gardens, how orchards were pruned, and when to sow or harvest by the stars. Gardens within monastery walls were cultivated with care and order. Often divided into quadrants, they grew not only food, but medicinal plants, balm for fever, salves for wounds, tonics for digestion. Lavender, sage, fennel, and comfrey were common, as were lesser-known plants like betony and rue. These gardens were both pharmacy and reflection, providing healing for the body and peace for the mind. Monks also kept meticulous records charts of weather, eclipses, and celestial movements. Through these observations, they tracked time and seasons, crucial for agricultural survival in a world without modern forecasting. The ringing of bells marked canonical hours, lords at dawn, compline at dusk, guiding not only prayer, but the rhythm of work and rest. Even architecture within the monastery reflected a quiet strategy for survival. Cloisters provided shelter from harsh winds, stone walls retained warmth in winter, and refectories were often placed on the southern side to catch sunlight. Rainwater from the roof was gathered in cisterns and used to irrigate the gardens. Waste was directed through channels away from wellsan, early understanding of sanitation that protected health, even if imperfect by modern standards. Illumination, the decoration of texts, was more than artistic expression. It helped readers navigate manuscripts and reinforced meaning through visual symbolism. Gold leaf was applied to halos and initials, not for beauty alone, but to reflect divine light. The process was painstaking, requiring careful handling of rare pigments lapis lazuli for blue, vermilion for red, and green earth from natural minerals. Life in the monastery was austere, yet structured. Meals were simple gruel, bread, and vegetables eaten in silence, while one monk read aloud from a text. Conversation was limited, often confined to designated times or places, but this silence was not emptiness. It was considered fertile ground for reflection, discipline, and learning. These quiet men scribes, gardeners, physicians were, in their own way, survivalists. They did not hunt or forage, but they preserved what might otherwise have been lost, the blueprints of resilience. Through their work, the wisdom of the ancients flowed forward like a candle passed through generations. And while the wider world changed through plague, war, or shifting borders, these centers of learning remained, a stabilizing presence. When times were hard, the monastery might feed the hungry from its stores, tend the sick with its herbs, or offer a warm bed to a wandering soul. It was a place where spiritual survival was deeply entwined with physical sustenance. Now, as the sky above the cloister darkens and the first stars appear in quiet procession, we will take leave of the monks and scholars. In the next chapter, we turn to the high places of society, not to celebrate their wealth, but to understand how the survival of elites, too, depended on careful systems, stored knowledge, and unseen hands. Now let us walk through a gate of wrought iron, beneath the arms of climbing ivy, and step into the grounds of a medieval manor. Here the air is still, touched by the faint aroma of wood smoke and crushed rosemary underfoot. Birds call gently from the eaves, and somewhere in the distance, the soft clip of hooves on stone paths echoes faintly. To live as a noble in the medieval world was not, as one might imagine, an escape from the burdens of survival. While the manor might have been furnished with carved wood and embroidered tapestries, it was still subject to the same fundamental concerns as the peasants' cottage weather, food, illness, and the ceaseless demands of managing the land. Indeed, survival at the top required its own network of systems. The manor was not a place of idle luxury, but the nerve center of an estate often dozens, even hundreds of acres wide. It functioned like a small ecosystem, with its own grain stores, smithy, brewhouse, stables, and sometimes even a chapel or infirmary. Lords and ladies depended deeply on the labor and knowledge of others, from the steward who managed harvest yields, to the cook who preserved meat against spoilage, to the falconer or herbalist, quietly maintaining both tradition and protection. Let us begin in the kitchen, an unassuming but vital place, often a separate building to reduce the risk of fire. Inside, the hearth was large, and spits turned slowly over glowing coals. There, cooks practiced techniques that are scarcely remembered now, roasting with indirect heat, preserving meats in lard or salt, fermenting cabbage into something sharp and enduring. Spices were used not to disguise rot, as is sometimes believed, but as status symbols, imported luxuries that indicated reach and wealth. Yet even so, salt, vinegar, honey, and smoke were the true guardians of food longevity. The larder, cooled by thick walls and shaded from sun, held sacks of grain and wheels of cheese, crocks of butter submerged in brine, and smoked hams hung from beams. Barrels of ale and mead stood nearby, not simply for merriment, but because clean water could not always be trusted. Low-alcohol drinks were consumed daily, even by children, as they were often safer than a stream whose purity could not be guaranteed. Beyond the manor walls stretched the domain, the land kept by the lord for his own use. Here, oxen ploughed furrows in the spring. Hay was cut and stacked into conical mounds. In autumn, The harvest was collected with care, measured and stored, because a single poor yield could bring hunger even to a noble house. Manor rolls were maintained by scribes, tallying who owed grain, poultry, or days of labour. Inside the manor, in the quieter corners, lived other, more intimate forms of survival. Herbs were steeped into poultices for headaches or fevers. Linen was boiled and sun-dried to reduce lice and disease. In times of illness, leeches might be applied more from hope than efficacy. Yet there were skilled healers, often women of the household, who understood which teas calmed a racing heart, or which leaves eased childbirth. Even noble clothing, layered and rich, served a practical purpose. Woolen outer garments protected from cold. Undergarments made from linen were breathable and easier to wash, allowing the wearer to keep cleaner longer. Cloaks were lined with fur, and boots stuffed with straw or wool for insulation. While beauty and appearance mattered, they were never separated entirely from practicality. Let us now walk toward the Solara private, warmer upper room where the family would gather, often near the best windows. Tapestries hung not just as decoration, but to break the chill from stone walls. Wooden chests held linens, herbs, and documents carefully guarded. The noble household, despite its privileges, was never far from uncertainty. Wars could displace. Disease could strike. Famine respected no rank. And so, every luxury was underpinned by calculation, foresight, and tradition. Nobles often kept falcons or hounds, not simply for sport, but for acquiring food-game birds or deer, could supplement stores, especially in leaner months. Hunting was also a way to demonstrate control over land, reinforcing authority not just in title, but in visible action. In truth, the noble life was one of layers of protection, of planning, of performance. It may have looked effortless from a distance, but up close, it was stitched together with the same care and vigilance that governed the village or the monastery. The stakes were different, the margins broader, but the principle remained. To survive meant to understand, to prepare, and to endure. As night falls upon the manor and candles flicker behind narrow windows, let us now shift focus from the settled life of homes and halls to the restless survival of those who wandered. Traders, pilgrims, and wayfarers. In the next chapter, we follow the winding roads of medieval travel and discover the humble tools and techniques that allowed people to survive on foot, far from hearth and home. Now, picture yourself on a narrow, rutted road, its edges softened by grass and the occasional tuft of wild chamomile. The air is cooler here, open and shifting, touched by the scent of distant fires and the faint, sweet tang of crushed herbs beneath your step. The road stretches far ahead, winding gently through hills and fields, a ribbon of movement in a largely stationary world. In the medieval era, to travel was to step deliberately into uncertainty. Roads were not always safe, nor marked with signs or milestones. And yet, thousands did it each year: pilgrims, traders, messengers, wandering craftsmen, and seekers of healing or absolution. Survival for these wayfarers depended not on permanence, but on preparation, ritual, and shared understanding. Let us begin with the pilgrim. A pilgrim's journey was both spiritual and deeply physical. Destinations like Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, or the shrine of a local saint could draw travelers from across the region. Some traveled for penance, others for healing, still more in hopes of earning indulgences or fulfilling vows made in moments of desperation or gratitude. These travelers carried little: a sturdy woolen cloak, a wide-brimmed hat, a staff or walking stick, often tipped with metal to deter dogs or lift brush from the path. Around their neck, a pouch of coins, herbs, or relics. Across their back, a satchel or small sack with dried bread, salted meat, perhaps a chunk of cheese wrapped in linen. Some pilgrims bore symbols of their journey: a scallop shell for Santiago, a badge or brooch for others. They walked in groups when they could. There was safety in numbers, and companionship made the miles gentler, Inns were few and costly. Many relied on the charity of monasteries or hospices along major routes. These houses offered not luxury, but rest, straw mattresses, a bowl of pottage, a basin of water. Illness was common, and injuries from falls, poor shoes, or exposure were expected. Yet the human body, when given time, adapts. Calluses formed, muscles toughened. People learned how to wrap blisters with moss, how to dry boots near not over the fire, how to find water by following animal paths or asking shepherds. Traders and merchants walked similar paths, though often with pack animals or carts. Their burden was goods, bolts of cloth, salt, dried fish, spices, tools. They knew which bridges were passable, which markets had the best fees, and where tolls might be expected. Maps were rare and unreliable. Instead, memory, landmarks, and oral accounts guided their progress. For the medieval traveller, wayfinding relied on natural cues, the moss on trees, the angle of the sun, the sound of bells from a distant village. River crossings were pivotal where a ferry or bridge existed. Settlements and commerce clustered. Where none did, one had to judge carefully. Could the horse ford safely? Was the current swift? Even the rhythm of travel followed the day's light, early to start, early to stop. Shelter came in many forms, under a tree, in the lee of a barn, or nestled beside a stone wall, curled beneath a cloak. Fires were made small, if at all, to avoid attention. Food was simple whatever had been brought, or could be traded or foraged along the way. Chestnuts, wild apples, a handful of dried beans, a flask of weak ale or vinegar water, which kept longer than plain water. Language varied, but gestures bridged the gap. A raised hand, a shared crust of bread. There were rules of the road, unwritten but known. Share the fire, respect the silence, don't ask too many questions. Strangers could be allies, or threats. The traveller learned to read faces as well as landscapes. Yet not all was hardship. Many roads passed through monasteries and towns, where fairs brought music, food, and news from faraway lands. Pilgrims might carry stories back home. Merchants bartered not just goods, but gossip. Wandering minstrels passed songs from one region to another, stitching the fabric of culture together. Even the act of movement, rare in a largely sedentary society, brought with it a certain wisdom. Travellers were witnesses to the wide variation of human life, of soil and custom and dialect. There were also wayside shrines and roadside crosses, where people paused to pray, reflect, or rest. Trees with ribbons tied to their branches, wells said to bring healing, stones worn smooth by the hands of generations seeking guidance. These were markers not just of faith, but of presenza, quiet reassurance that others had passed here and survived. As the stars begin to prick through the deepening sky, imagine laying your cloak upon soft grass, your staff tucked under one arm, your pack as a pillow. You stare upward, hearing the soft rustle of the wind in distant hedgerows, the crackle of twigs in the fire beside you. Tomorrow, the road continues. Tonight, you rest. In the next segment of our quiet journey, we'll return from the roads to the workshops and stalls of the medieval town, where craftspeople and merchants practiced the delicate survival of trade and tradition in the heart of a changing world. Now, let us enter a place where footsteps echo on cobblestones and the morning hum rises slowly, like mist from the river. You are standing at the edge of a medieval town, just as it begins to wake. The air is cool, touched by the faint aroma of bread baking and the sharper scent of leather and dye. A bell sounds in the distance, the monastery perhaps, or the town hall and shutters creak open along narrow lanes. In this world of timber-framed houses and thatched roofs, the craftspeople live and labour. Their survival was not in the forest, nor the field, nor the high halls of nobility, but in the measured rhythm of trade, technique, and tenacity. These artisans were the keepers of skill, and through their work communities endured. Let us begin with the weaver, In a dim, dry room, the clack of the loom is steady, unhurried. Threads are pulled taut across wooden beams, dyed yarn-coloured with wode for blue, madder for red, or weld for yellowish, woven into patterns both simple and intricate. Cloth was one of the most important commodities of the medieval world. It clothed rich and poor alike, and towns grew wealthy on its trade. Weaving was often a domestic task, done in tandem with other duties, but in larger towns it became an organised craft, governed by guilds and trained through long apprenticeships. Next door, the blacksmith hammers rhythmically, each strike sending sparks dancing. His forge is warm, soot-darkened, and filled with the tang of metal and sweat. He shapes tools, hinges, ploughshares, nails each small piece essential to the broader machinery of survival. The smithy was often at the heart of a town or village, not for status, but necessity. Nearby, the potter turns a wheel, hands firm and practiced. Clay from local earth is shaped into bowls, jugs, and roof tiles. Once fired, these wares will find their way into hearths, marketplaces, and even distant lands via trade routes. Pottery was not decorative first, it was functional, and when broken, repurposed as drainage shards or insulation in cottage walls. The shoemaker, or cobbler, works beside a small window where light spills onto his bench. Leather is cut with precise movements, softened with oil, and stitched tightly. Shoes, boots, and sandals were precious expensive to replace, often mended many times. A cobbler's shop smelled richly of tallow, beeswax, and hide, and his knowledge of fitting soles to shape and season was both craft and care. Above these shops, families slept and cooked, ate and aged. The distinction between work and home was often blurred. Trade happened on the same street where children played and elders rested. Tools were passed down. Apprentices learned by watching, imitating, and then doing, until the craft lived in their muscles and breath. In the town square, stalls are assembled before first light. A merchant from a nearby port unfurls bolts of foreign cloth, whisper-thin and unfamiliar. A woman sets out wooden bowls filled with dried herbs. A man slices cheese from a wheel wrapped in straw. Here, in the marketplace, survival became social. Barter, trade, and coin exchanged hands, but also knowledge weather reports from travellers, news of distant wars, rumours of good harvests or bad omens. Markets were noisy but orderly. Guilds regulated who could sell what and where. Measures were inspected, weights verified. Bakers who shorted their loaves could face fines, or worse. Yet beneath the formality, there was generosity too. Surplus food was sometimes quietly handed to the poor, and skilled craftspeople might mend a tool for a friend without charge. Children learned these systems early. A boy might carry coal to the forge. A girl might wind skeins of thread for her mother's loom. Survival was communal. One person's skill was another's necessity, and interdependence wove through the town like the lanes that curved between houses. Even the town itself was built for endurance. High walls in some places protected from raiders or wild beasts. A central well or fountain served many. Streets sloped gently, draining water toward ditches lined with stone or thatch. Waste management was imperfect, but not ignored. Craftspeople often disposed of dye or offal in designated areas outside the walls, sometimes using the byproducts for tanning or fertilizer. And above it all, in towers or spires, bells rang marking the hours, the market open, the curfew, the call to prayer. Time was not mechanical, but it was shared. The rhythm of the day of work, pause, meal, and sleep was guided by sound and season. The medieval town, then, was not just a place of trade. It was a carefully balanced organism, each person and craft supporting another. Its survival lay not in its walls, but in its people quietly, skillfully tending to the art of making, mending, and maintaining the world around them. As we now leave the market square, let us take one final path toward the edge of society, where the forgotten and marginalized lived. In the next chapter, we will gently examine how those without land, title, or trade found ways to endure, often through resilience that history barely recorded. Now let us walk away from the town's gentle bustle, toward the edges where the cobbled streets give way to rougher paths. Here, where fences lean and the forest reclaims its ground, lived those who did not quite belong. The people history so often overlooks those without land or guild, without charter or steady roof survived in quieter, humbler ways. In the medieval world, hierarchy shaped not just society, but geography. The further from the centre one lived, the more tenuous their place. Yet even here, in makeshift shelters or abandoned crofts, life persisted. It was not always lawful, it was rarely secure, but it endured. Some of these edge-dwellers were wanderers people, displaced by war, famine, or plague. Others were born to it, children of beggars, orphans, or those whose trades had fallen out of favour. There were also women labelled as wise, or strange, or dangerous midwives, herbalists, or those whose knowledge ran parallel to the sanctioned teachings of church or guild. These women, often called cunning folk, or simply the old ones, carried ancient understandings of plants and the body. They treated fevers with willow bark, calmed the belly with mint, and drew poultices from bread, salt, and wild herbs. Their knowledge was not always written down, but spoken, passed from hand to hand like seeds. Their homes were modes huts thatched with reeds, floors of packed earth, tools handmade or bartered. The fire was central, as it was in every home. Food was foraged, begged, or grown in tiny garden patches. Leeks, beans, sorrel, and perhaps a few hens scratching near the door. Water came from streams or springs, carried in clay jugs with worn handles. Clothing was patched and repatched, made from cast-offs or spun from rough wool. Yet in every garment there was ingenuity, a hidden seam, a warmer lining, a bit of embroidery stitched, not for beauty, but for strength. Some lived in outlawed conditions, not criminals perhaps, but refugees from the law's complex and rigid boundaries, a former serf who fled his lord's land, a leper banished from town, a heretic who dared question too loudly. These people survived by barter, by secrecy, or by kindness offered in unexpected places. Sometimes a townsperson left bread at the edge of a lane. Sometimes a passing pilgrim shared a coin or a story. Children born to these margins learned early. They knew how to find wild onions in spring, how to dig burdock roots in fall. They recognized the tone of the wind before a storm. They ran errands for coins or watched livestock for those who could not afford full-time help. Even the beggars, those who walked from door to door with nothing but outstretched hands, knew the language of survival. They memorized which households were generous, which feasts brought leftovers, and which saints' days stirred a mood of charity. Some sang or told riddles. Others wore signs of their condition, a wooden leg, a blindfold, a symbol of piety meant to soften the heart. In this liminal space, faith was both anchor and compass, a wooden cross around the neck, a whispered prayer before sleep, a hope that the next day might bring warmth, or bread, or simply the absence of pain. Yet not all was bleak. There was laughter, 2 quiet moments around the fire, songs sung in low voices, stories passed on beneath starlight. Community formed in the unlikeliest places. A shared meal, a repaired cloak, a warning whispered about a nearby patrol. Survival at the margins did not depend on institutions, it depended on people. And sometimes, when fortune turned, a healer might be called into town. A beggar might be taken in during a storm. A child might find apprenticeship or favour. The boundary between centre and edge was porous, shifting like mist. As we now return from these outer places, let us reflect for a moment on all the forms that survival took. It was not one strategy, but many. It lived in bread and fire, in ink and stone, in footsteps on long roads, and the weaving of thread. From manor to marketplace, from monastery to moor, medieval survival was a patchwork quilt frayed at the edges, warm at the centre, and stitched with care by countless unrecorded hands. In our final segment, we will gently draw together these threads, looking back on the quiet ingenuity of a world where survival was not loud or celebrated, but constant and deeply human. And now, as our long and quiet walk through the medieval world draws to a close, let your thoughts settle like dust on a sun-warmed windowsill. The rhythm of survival, the slow weaving of cloth, the tending of fire, the careful shaping of wood and word still lingers in the air, gentle and persistent. You've walked past flickering hearths and across damp forest floors. You've stood beside monastic walls, sat with travelling pilgrims, and stepped into humble market stalls. In every place, in every person, survival was not a grand gesture, but a daily discipline. It was the art of noticing when to plant, when to mend, when to listen, when to wait. It was not bold, but steady, not loud, but enduring. Though the tools have changed, and the pace of life has accelerated, much of what they knew, those forgotten techniques and quiet rituals, still holds meaning. The way they preserved food without cold, the way they tracked seasons by stars and soil, the way they shared burdens across generations, through spoken knowledge and communal hands. They lived closer to the edge of uncertainty, and in that space, they built systems not of convenience, but of necessity. Systems that required patience, observation, and trust in rhythms larger than themselves. And in remembering them, knowing, imagining their homes, their footsteps, their careful gestures, we do not simply learn about the past. We reconnect with a quieter part of ourselves, a part that still values warmth, care, preparation, and simple endurance. So, breathe in once more. Let the stillness of their world mingle with yours, the dim glow of a fire, the hush of early morning, the soft press of wool against your skin. Let it wrap around you like a well-worn cloak. The past is not far. It rests beside us, in forgotten corners and old instincts. And as you drift now gently, slowly, into rest, know that even in the simplest acts of care and survival, there is quiet wisdom that carries forward. Good night, traveller of time. May your dreams be calm, your breath steady, and your sleep deep held in the hush of ancient hands.